So when I was just making my list for the best Japanese horror movies, I realized that while some of them are great films, not all of them were really scary. And the main reason we come to horror movies, more than anything else, is to be scared. So I wanted to make a new list just focusing on Japanese horror movies that actually scared me. Movies that would stay with me afterwards and make me lose sleep. So that's what this list is going to be going by. And you know, horror is subjective, so what I find scary, you may not. But anyway, let's get on to the scares. So first on the list, we have Seance. This is a year 2000 Japanese horror thriller, directed by the great Kiyoshi Kurosawa. And you know, later on, he'd go on to make some of the most iconic J-horrors like Pulse and Cure. And Seance, in a lot of ways, is a precursor to both of those films. And this tells the story of a psychic housewife and her husband. They become burdened with a kidnapped girl who escaped her asylum. And so the girl ends up dying, and her ghost begins to haunt this couple. And that's when things get good. So, honestly, this movie really creeped me out. But it surprised me because it's very subtle in the way it does that. You know, it's a very low-budget film. In fact, it's a TV movie. And so it doesn't really have too many of Kurosawa's iconic camera tricks yet. But I'll say that the low quality actually adds to this movie. It really just gives it a creepier feeling. And there's also just a really creepy score. It's sort of like a heartbeat. It's very unusual. This movie really just creeps on you. And I like how the ghost in this isn't just trying to be scary. It's more so just there in a natural way. And just the way Kurosawa does ghost films is just very unique. You know, his ghosts aren't really dangerous. Instead, like I said, they're just hanging out. And this is actually Kurosawa's first real ghost movie. You know, his first attempt at what would become his trademark. And a lot of that style is missing or just found in small amounts, since this is basically the prototype of what would later go on to become Pulse or Retribution. But there is a scene in this that really scared me. And it's different because it's actually during the daytime. And there's this scene with this ghost girl just blackened and just standing there. And it just looks so unnatural. It really got to me. And it's not easy to film a scary scene during the day. But this film just shows that scary things are always there. You're never quite safe in this world. There's always unknown horrors. And next we have Marebito. So Marebito is just a very eerie, atmospheric Japanese horror movie. It follows this sort of amateur filmmaker with his camera, and he sort of brings it wherever he goes. And for some reason, he's investigating this really dark subway station. And it eventually leads underground to this sinister labyrinth. And he just encounters these sort of mysterious creatures and lost souls just inhabiting the place. And eventually, this silent young woman that's just chained to a wall. And so he brings the woman to his apartment, and that's a decision he will soon regret. So director Takashi Shimizu is just a master of horror. You know, he gave us the iconic Ju-On series. And I just love how Lovecraftian this film is. It really makes your imagination just wonder. You know, what unknown horrors really exist in this world. And I just love how Shinya Tsukamoto is in this. He's just one of my favorite directors, and, you know, I love whenever he's just in a role, too. And the first time I watched this, I actually thought it was one of his films because it has that same sort of low budget, unpredictable, creepy feel. You know, nothing quite is like his films, but this one is sort of close. And the woman creature character that Tsukamoto's character finds in this is true horror. You know, it's like something not from this world that you shouldn't have, and you just know it's gonna end bad. But there's this one scene that's just a close-up of her face in the shadows. In fact, I remember I was in my basement after watching this, and I started to just think about that scene, and I was really starting to get creeped out. So because this movie made me afraid to be in dark places, I'll say that it earns a spot on this list. And next we have Takashi Miike's Audition. So Audition has really just become a staple of J-horror. And you know, I kind of hate to include it just because it's mentioned on every single list. But I really can't deny that it did have a disturbing effect on me. And just what I find so fascinating about it is that the movie really starts off not trying to be a horror movie. The premise itself is almost innocent and kind of funny. And it follows his widowed husband and his film producer friend, and they hold these fake auditions to find a part to eventually become his new wife. You know, they're telling these ladies that it's a part for a film, but it really isn't. And this all just eventually leads to him finding this very soft-spoken woman named Asami. And just from there, the movie progressively gets more and more unsettling. And I just find that a hell of a lot more disturbing than any of the grotesque images that this film would later be known for. And I remember the first time I watched it, I was actually kind of bored. Because I was just waiting for the disturbing stuff. You know, I already knew about the ending. And after I finished it, you know, I kind of just shrugged it off, but something didn't sit right with me. But still, I didn't really have any nightmares or anything about it. And I even forgot about it. But months later, when I was in the hospital, I remember my nurse that I had a really striking resemblance to Asami. And that scary voice that she had in the movie just kept popping up in my mind. And after that, I just had these horrific nightmares about the film. And it turned out that the movie did indeed disturb me. And it was just secretly haunting me this entire time. And it could be because the horror that's in it is actually based in reality. And it does deal with some very dark subjects. So whenever I revisit this one, I always do so with caution. Just because there is something very sinister about this film. Just for it to be able to hit me with such a delayed effect. That definitely makes it frightening. And next we have Tetsuo the Iron Man. So it's almost impossible to describe Tetsuo the Iron Man to someone who's never seen it before. The only way I could describe it as just being like an actual nightmare put to screen. And it's filmed on this micro budget, and it just lingers on these shots of metallic objects with very unnatural movements. There's a heavy use of claymation, and it all just looks very surreal and like nothing I've ever seen before. Whenever I rewatch it, I'm always just surprised by it. And normally I would be put off by sort of this artsy style that it has, but for some reason I just find this film different and just fascinating. And the movie is just terrifying at times. I'll never forget the first time I watched it. It was on my phone, in a car, on this really rainy day. And even then, it was still effective. And the whole film is a nightmare, but the scariest scene is definitely the part with this lady at this train station. Just the unnatural movements of her and just how the camera just sporadically moves around. I can only describe it as being that moment in a nightmare where it's just so scary that you just jump up with fear and you're sweating. So Tetsuo the Iron Man really is fascinating, and it really has to be seen to be believed. That is, of course, if you can stomach it. Proceed with caution, it's very disturbing. And next we have Ju-on the Grudge. So Ju-on the Grudge really has become this icon of J-horror. Ringu is a fantastic film, but it isn't creepy, nor is it as terrifying as Ju-on the Grudge. And that's because Ju-on just relies on a very tense and eerie ambience. It uses sound, lighting, and just set design to just build this really haunting feeling. Also, the minimalist soundtrack with very unsettling noises, and just a meticulous use of silence. It all intensifies the suspense, and just makes the viewer anticipate something terrifying happening, even when there's not really anything going on screen. So the editing is just perfection, and it really makes it a unpredictable watch. And I remember the trailer itself gave me nightmares way back. And I finally came around to watching it years later, the original as an adult. And still, I straight up froze the first time I saw the ghost girl Kayako. And just the crackling sound she makes of her throat. It's extremely effective. Also, Toshio, the ghost boy meowing. It should be funny, but it's not. It's very creepy. And just the images in this film, they conjure up that type of fear that I picture being in very dark, scary places. And just for that, it definitely gets a spot on this list. So Ju-on the Grudge is a horror classic, and it's effective. And next we have Noroi the Curse. And I'll just say, to this day, no matter how many new horror movies I watch, Noroi is still the one that I have trouble watching at night. And it's just one of those movies that you'll not want to be thinking about, but still find yourself thinking about. So this one's responsible for a lot of lost sleep. And Noroi is actually one of the earliest found footage films, and I'll say it's the most effective one that I've seen. And there really is some legit scenes of horror in this. And just the way it's done is almost genius. It actually uses your memory against you. So you may spot something subtle in the film, just like an object on someone's porch, and then with the knowledge that you get from the film later on, that object will become linked to something scary. And then all of a sudden, that scene will become terrifying. And it just deals with really creepy topics that at least get under my skin, like curses, ancient rituals, demons. And the scary scenes really do stay with you, especially the ending, which is just classic in J-horror. So this really is just an all-around scary movie and a fantastic Japanese horror film. And number one is Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Pulse. And apparently I'm not alone in believing that Pulse is terrifying. I noticed that whenever the subject of just scary scenes gets brought up now, people often do mention this film and its iconic hallway scene. So it seems like more people are just finding out about this absolute horror gem. And there's entire video essays done on why that hallway scene is the scariest scene of all time. But I remember the first time I watched this movie, and that scene just kind of came out of nowhere. I love how this movie doesn't just give its scares away. They definitely just creep up on you. And just the horrifying, unnatural movements of the ghosts just look plain wrong. And that's why it's so effective. But the film is also just full of these liminal scenes. You know, dark atmospheric backgrounds, just a feeling of loneliness. And it just permeates throughout the entire film. In fact, I have heard that director Kiyoshi Kurosawa travels around Japan just looking for abandoned buildings to film for his movies. And it was really interesting how this film was just able to predict that the internet would actually make people lonelier. You know, coming out in just the year 2001, the internet was still a very new concept. And there's another really creepy scene where one of the characters thinks that someone is watching them from online. Something that could even apply to today. And even the score in this is really well done and scary. Sounds like a bunch of sirens singing. It's just a very menacing type of sound. And I like how the ghosts in this and Kurosawa's other films are just different. You know, just like with Seance, they aren't trying to attack or scare you. But instead, they're just there in a natural way. It creates this scary reality where ghosts are just everywhere. And they're silent so they could just sneak up on you. And actually, something interesting happened the last time I watched this movie. It was really late at night, and I just kept dozing off. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw this image of the ghost from this movie just silhouetted on the wall. And I could almost visualize it. It was very surreal, and I just, of course, kept waking up every time I saw it, because it was creepy. And the movie is just full of haunting images that will just creep into your minds late at night, you know, especially when you don't want them to. So a ton of sleep was lost with this movie. So Pulse is just a horror masterpiece, and not only the scariest Japanese movie, but just one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. So that's my list of Japanese movies that actually scared me. And I'm sure some of you were expecting Ringu to be on here, but honestly, I found the American remake to be scarier. And all the other J-horror classics are great films, but they didn't scare me. And again, you know, fear is very subjective. So let me know what Japanese horror movies or just movies in general scared you. And have a happy, scary Halloween.